Hey pole dancer, welcome to the Evidence-Based Pole Podcast. My name is Rosy Boa. I'm a pole dancer, pole teacher, and personal trainer. And I've started this podcast so that we can learn together, talk with the experts, read the research, and feel better on and off the pole. So if that sounds like something you're interested in doing, let's go. Before we hop in, I just really quickly want to come in and let you know that coming up May 17th through 19th, I have a 3-day challenge called the Pole for Pleasure Challenge. It's going to be 3 30-minute guided movement sessions. We're going to work on our strength and flexibility. We're going to learn some pole movement. We're going to, go through a whole pole pathway, actually. We're going to do some guided freestyle. So even if you've never freestyled before, I'm going to make this really accessible, really fun. I'm really looking forward to it. I've been hearing from a lot of folks that recently it's just been a struggle to have fun and enjoy themselves with pole. So let's change that together. And I'll put a link to sign up in the show notes. So I hope to see you there. How can you tell if a journal article or any sort of scientific research that's been published is untrustworthy and you definitely shouldn't trust it? So this topic came up because I have a Google Scholar alert set up. So whenever somebody publishes a new article on pole dancing, I get a little alert. If you don't know how to do that, you can go to scholar.google.com/scholar_alerts and set that up for yourself if you are a nerd like I am. And I recently got a notification and I was like, oh, this sounds kind of interesting. And I clicked through, and as I was reading the article, I was like, this is not real science, right? This is maybe a term paper, I guess. It was pretty poorly written that someone had written and then had paid to get published in a predatory journal. But I could tell that because I have a background in science, right? I have a research doctorate. I've done a lot of literature reviews, and I was like, this does not pass the sniff test. But just sort of looking at it, if you didn't have that background, you may not have picked up on that. So I put together this episode to really talk about how we can evaluate the quality of evidence, or rather the container that the evidence comes in. And I will start with a little bit of a disclaimer, and that is that the quality of scientific research is really something that is decided by peers of the researcher, usually. So there's something called peer review, and it's recently broken down in a lot of disciplines. I'm thinking here specifically of some of the computer science adjacent fields, but setting that aside, generally, if research is published, it's been reviewed by one or more other researchers that work in that same field, and they've gone through it and been like, okay, using my expert knowledge of the methodology that they're using and also the underlying subject matter, I can be like, yes, this is probably a reasonable result we can trust, or no, there's probably something wrong here. And that process didn't catch this article that I was talking about because it wasn't peer reviewed. So let's talk about some ways, some red flags, if you will, that you can use to figure out that, okay, this article is not worth reading, it is not worth trusting, it's probably not going to have good information on it. So figuring out whether it does have good information is a second step that we leave to the people who are actively working in that field. So we're going to go from easiest to figure out to least easy to figure out. So the first one is actually more for just generally science communication. You'll sometimes hear people talk about SciComm. That's what that is. And if someone is referencing in their decision-making a study, or referencing a study in an attempt to get you to make a decision, the way that they talk about that study, right? So when I talk about a specific study, I'm going to tell you right now, I am not going to cite this bogus predatory journal article in the show notes, but I generally try to cite specific studies so that you have the exact information that you'd need to go and look up that study and read it for yourself. But if people are trying to influence your behavior and they don't do that, and they say things like, studies show, okay, which studies? We are specific when we talk about research, or a recent study, and then don't say who did the study or where or what the methodology was or where it was published, or, what was the effect size, which we'll probably not talk about later, but basically if something is reliable and has a large effect on the thing that you're studying, generally you're going to have a large effect size Well, things can be reliable and have a small effect size, but that's not useful information, right? Like if I tell you if you get out of bed with your right leg every morning, your, right hamstring is going to be 0.000001 microns longer at the end of the day with a really high consistency, that is not helpful information for you going around your day. That was an aside about statistics. I'm going to try and keep the asides to a minimum. But that's the sort of information that I would want if someone says, get out of bed with your right leg for flexibility gains. Recent study shows that, right? I'd want to have more information to evaluate that claim and be like, okay, yeah, that seems reasonable. Or like, this is a bogus. This is not information that I feel confident enough in that I'm going to change my day-to-day life because of it. Other sort of weasel phrases that I'd watch out for, things like psychology shows or like doctors show, anything where it's just like a field has sort of made this proclamation. Again, very much not the way science works. That's definitely sometimes the way that like pop science communication works. And I think that it's poor scholarship. And when it's scholars doing it, it drives me up the wall. Or another one that you'll hear is like, scientists in Japan did X. This may shock you, but there's actually more than one scientist in Japan, so that is not sufficiently specific to help you figure out, A, find the specific study, and then B, evaluate the quality of that study. So if people are just sort of talking about studies and they use these very broad terms and they don't include citations, that is a big red flag. And if they say like, a recent study shows, and then have a link to the study in the article, that's perfectly fine, but some things to watch out for. And then once you're like, okay, there's a specific study, so you have gotten out of the scientists in Iceland weird rabbit hole, a couple of things to look for in the article itself once you have it open to decide whether or not it's going to be something that you're, should be willing to consider. So one thing is, particularly if there is a single author on the paper, so generally, not always, but generally in fields adjacent to movement, so things like medicine, anatomy, kinesiology, often studies are going to have multiple authors, not all the time, but if there's a single author and that author only has one study published, or if that author has 3,000 studies published, those are both huge red flags. The first one tells me that, potentially this is a student. If it is a student, they will probably have their university email, and you'll be able to go and like find their website and be like, oh yeah, they're in their second year of their, PhD program. Good job to them. Or it's just a, someone who's trying to have a study published to maybe get ahead in their job, to mislead someone about the quality of their research. And then the 3,000 studies published, I was a very prolific scholar for my field when I was actively doing research. That's too many studies. That is either someone being intentionally misleading, or there's some sort of like typo in the backend database that you're looking to look things up in. So both of those, big red flags. Another thing to look for is lots of typos, right? Lots of errors, lots of weird copy, not copy editing, but like typesetting, right? Like the fonts look weird, the spacing is weird. And I say this as someone who is dyslexic. You should be working with an editor at a journal, right? And you're going to go through a couple rounds of peer review. So people will find and tell you about typos. Believe me, it was a constant strain in my life that I made so many typos, but by the time my journal articles were actually published, they were mostly fixed. So if there's a lot of errors, that's a red flag. Also, if there's graphs or pictures, if they're very grainy, if they're very pixelated, if the text is too small to read, all huge red flags. When you're writing a scientific article, you want to make sure that all the information that you're presenting is as clear as possible. So anything like that, tells me, the author doesn't understand what vector images are, which is generally something you get yelled about pretty early on in your scientific training, if you are in a field that works with graphs, or they're trying to obfuscate something, or they've just copied and pasted something off of a Google image search. I hate to say it. Also, I've noticed this specifically for poll journal articles. If there's a lot of photos of people doing poll in the article, and there's not a clear justification for that in the text of the article and the caption for the photos, right? Like, dancer is doing a jade split, indicating the need for active hip, mobility in this movement. See text section 14 or something. And it's just like a lot of photos of people doing poll. Huge red flag. Why are those in there? Are you trying to fill up space? Are you trying to make a word count? Not generally a problem for scholars, because we're always having to cut stuff out because we have more to say than we have space to say. Not always, but that is definitely my experience the vast majority of the time. Also, if you can't find a website for the first author, right? So again, I mentioned, possibly they are a student, possibly this is their first journal article. If they've gotten it, it's gone through peer review rather, that's fantastic. Kind of unlikely, I hate to say it, kind of unlikely that your first article in a, body sciences related journal is going to be just a single author article, and that also you're not going to have a website at that point in time. So, again, a little bit of a red flag. And also, if the citations seem kind of random, right? So generally you want to see a mix of citations of papers that are a little bit older. For poll specifically, probably the earliest, largest citation that people will use based on my reading is Empowerment and the Pole, a Discursive Investigation of the Reinvention of Pole Dancing as a Recreational Activity from 2009. Which I would say, if you are not a feminist scholar, I don't know that I would necessarily recommend reading, but just to learn more about pole dance. But you would definitely want to see a citation, of work from the, late aughties onward. And you would also probably want to see foundational earlier citations in whatever other field they're bringing in, right? So anatomy, psychology, feminist literature, right? And you don't want to see all articles from the last 2 years being cited in this domain. That's a big red flag. Honestly, it's a big red flag in other domains as well, but something to look out for. And then a couple researchers in particular you can look out for that seem to be pretty well cited in this sort of general space. So Tim Kurz and Callie Whitehead wrote that 2009 article that I mentioned. So Whitehead and Kurz, that's Kurz 2009, and that was in Feminism and Psychology. I've also seen Kimberly McFadden from Canada cited quite a bit, and also Kurz and Whitehead I think are both from Australia. And then Joanna Nichols, also from Australia, I tend to see cited quite a bit. And also for papers that I'm interested in particular, there's a study from 2019, Prevalence of Pole Dance Injuries from a Global Online Survey in the Journal of Sports Medicine and Physical Fitness by Lin and Tan. Apologies if I'm saying that incorrectly. Probably Tan. And I see that cited quite a bit as well. So I would expect to see sort of citations in that general sort of citation network. And if I don't, that tells me that these researchers are not in discourse. Speaking about discourse again, with the other existing researchers who are already working in the field. And that tells me that the quality of their literature review was probably not great, given that, again, I have no formal training in this field in particular. These are the studies that I have seen cited again and again in research that otherwise looked to be of high quality to me. So these are the signals that I am looking for based on my very, I don't want to say cursory, but naive, I guess, exploration of this area of the literature. So if a graduate student or, a doctoral researcher is unable to find those same citations, I would be a little bit hesitant about the quality of the rest of their research, because the literature review is very, very foundational to doing good science. So I think those are pretty easy to look for. Now we're going to get into things that are a little bit more challenging to look for. So a big one is there a conflict of interest in funding? And do you know the funding that was used for the study? So Generally, you're going to see in a journal article, the authors will have their institutional affiliations listed. They may have more than one. That's also not uncommon. And in addition, if there was outside funding for the research, which very, very common in sort of the medicine body domain, so you may have grants, those grants should be listed, and they'll be like usually a little footnote, sometimes at the bottom of the first page if it's paginated, where it'll be like funding for this research provided by like the NIH or whatever organization. And sometimes those organizations are professional organizations, and sometimes those professional organizations have a vested monetary interest in the outcome of the research, right? So if that's your funding source, you're probably not going to want to publish any studies that are like, we found no effect, or we found that this was actually harmful, or we did find an effect, but it was too small to be meaningful, right? Like the sort of moving the legs out of bed thing that I talked about in the beginning. That is a fake example, by the way. That's not a real study that anyone has done to my knowledge. I was just trying to come up with something silly. So that means that it's a little bit more, I would definitely take those results with a little bit more grain of sand, and you're more likely to see something called the file drawer effect. And this is a large bias in scientific publishing in general, which is where if an intervention is studied, most published studies are going to show that there is a positive effect of that intervention, because it is much harder to get a study published if what they say is like, hey, we tried it and nothing happened, or we tried it and it hurt. And there's I don't want to get too deep into research ethics, another topic of my expertise, actually. But generally, if you find that an intervention is hurting, you will stop the study at that point. And those studies get published more often in medicine, I think, but they don't always get published. They tend to get put in the file drawer because it's much easier to be like, we have a cure for cancer, than here are 999,000 things that don't work to cure cancer, basically. And also funding organizations don't love to hear that. So outside of funding organizations that have a conflict of interest, just like government grants in the US, let's say, if you're up for grant review and you're like, we tried a bunch of stuff and none of it worked, they don't tend to be delighted to give you more money at that point, unfortunately. And that's just a larger issue with science as a whole. So look into their funding sources. And again, this can be quite challenging because sometimes funding sources or organizations will sound like super legit, and then you look into it and you're like, oh, this is funded solely by like 3 petrochemical companies, right? So maybe their environmental review of the benefits of, seabirds drinking oil, I should take with a little bit of a grain of salt, right? So that's definitely something that I would look into. And this is a little bit harder to evaluate if you are outside of whatever field it is, but something to look into is the publication venue that the research has been published in of high quality? Because there's something called predatory journals. I don't know how common knowledge this is, but basically it's a scam and if you've ever published any research, you'll get a bunch of emails about it where they're like, you are invited to submit your work for like the International Journal of Excellence in, I don't know, basket weaving or whatever it is. And they'll be like, you are guaranteed nothing in scientific publishing is guaranteed. You try to get stuff published, but there's no guarantee that it will get published. But you're like, you're guaranteed to get this paper published. All you have to do is pay us $5,000. And their business model is not, traditional journal publishing companies also have kind of a skeezy business model, which is that the academics work for free, the editors work for free, the reviewers work for free, and the journals are extremely expensive, and they are paid for by generally institutional libraries. So it's basically funneling money from universities and research centers to these academic journal publishing companies. Is it unethical? Yes. Is it a huge problem? Yes. Am I a little bit of an open science person? Mm-hmm. You may have. Those of you who are also researchers may have noticed a little bit of a bias there in my particular thoughts and beliefs about science and how we do it. But as sucky as that is, it is less predatory than the you have to pay the journal, and then the journal will just publish whatever, basically, and they'll rubber stamp it, and they'll say it's been quote unquote peer reviewed. And this is where that study that I mentioned was published. It was published in one of these predatory journals. And the reason that people do this is that it's very prestigious to have published a journal article. It is very helpful for job applications, particularly academic jobs. If you've ever seen an academic CV, you know, professional resumes tend to be like 1, maybe 2 pages. Academic CVs can be 15, 20, 30 pages. Actually, mine is, I can tell you off the top of my head because I happen to need a copy of it recently. I'm just opening it up here. Let me scroll for a bit. And of course, the number of pages is going to depend on mine is 6 single-spaced pages, which would be ridiculous for a resume, but is perfectly reasonable in the world of academia, because what sort of helps you get tenure and get hired, and even for, you know, commercial research labs, is having published a lot of research. So people turn to these academic journals to get these publications that at first blush may look real but are in fact fake, because it's, I don't know if you knew this, a lot less work to write a fake journal article that doesn't have to go through peer review than it is to write a real journal article that does have to go through peer review. So, and how do you, so predatory journals, you can just sort of go to their sites and it'll be like fancy, oh, you know, we've got seals everywhere, it looks super official. But then if you go to like submitting a paper, it'll be like for the low publication fee of $5,000, or it'll be like a typesetting fee of $2,500 or something like that. And generally for more traditional journals, you're not going to have to pay to publish a paper unless you want it to be open access. And in that case, you have to pay the journal. Does that mean that you have to pay the journal to allow other people to read the work that you produced for free? Yes, it does. Again, like I said, traditional academic publishing, not the greatest, but the quality of work that comes out of it tends to be a little bit better because there's more institutional and social capital there, so people are willing to review it and are a little bit more gatekeepery. So generally, if you're looking for a journal that is considered particularly high quality, a general rule of thumb is that journals published by scholarly societies tend to be slightly higher quality. A scholarly society is basically a bunch of scholars working in a field will come together and be like, this is us. This is who we talk to. This is who is in our disciplinary bubble. Usually they'll have a conference, sometimes an annual conference, sometimes a biannual conference. It depends on the society. Usually it will be run by academics and generally people who have tenure, so very senior academics from a variety of different universities. So if you go and you look up like who's on the board, who's running the scholarly society, it'll be like Professor so-and-so from X, Professor so-and-so from Y, Professor so-and-so from Z. So there'll be diversity in who's on the board, some things that you can look at. Also, this is sort of weird, but journals that have very short names tend to be of higher quality because they tend to have been founded earlier. So Science is considered a very prestigious journal. Very short name. Nature is considered a very prestigious journal. Very short name. As an aside, Science and Nature in particular, Nature especially, will sometimes publish things that, because the peer review group is people outside the field, will sometimes publish things that people inside the field refuse to publish because it was for a variety of reasons, but usually for good ones. So Nature and Science articles in particular, I would maybe take with a little bit of grain of salt and see what the reaction to them has been from people working in that field. There's been some stinkers, let me put it that way. PLOS is similar, the Public Library of Science. Again, really variable quality work that comes out of there. So, but published by scholarly societies tend to have shorter names, and also that are older tend to be higher quality. So just sort of in the anatomy segment, an example that seems to be pretty high quality from what I can tell is the Journal of Anatomy. It's published by the Anatomical Society, which is a scholarly society. It's 150 years old, so it's been around for quite a while. And especially for older journals, usually you can find a history of science article that somebody has written about the history of the journal. So that's also something that you can look into. So I know that was a lot, and particularly if you don't have scientific training, that may feel a little bit overwhelming, but if you are interested in reading research first person without having it sort of filtered through, let's say, a scientific newsletter, or what's the word I'm looking for? Not like a newspaper, but like a news outlet, right? Where the reviews are written by journalists. And generally, if a review is written by a journalist, you would expect them to talk with, you'd expect them to summarize, okay, here's what's in the study, and then to talk with multiple other scholars in that same field who are not involved with the study to get their sort of input on it. So that's sort of how you can tell that a popular article discussing a scientific study is probably okay. Again, not always, things vary. So just to review that, first of all, if people are discussing studies and they're just like super vague, like a recent study or psychology shows, be suspicious. Be a little suspicious Sammy, and just sort of dig in there and be like, what study? What recent study? How recent? How recent counts as recent also varies from discipline to discipline. So in some disciplines, it is within the same month that you are reading it in, and for some disciplines, it's going to be in the last 10 years. So it varies dramatically. Also, just like a laundry list of things to watch out for. Is this the author's only study? Are they the only author on the study? Are there lots of typos? Are the graphs of really low quality visually? Especially for pole journals, are there just like a lot of pictures of pole dancers that aren't necessitated by the text? That's a little bit sus. If you can't find a website for the first author, and again, if they're a student, maybe come back in a couple of years. Maybe, everything was fine and you can go back and read their earlier work and be like, okay, this is actually fine, but maybe not. The citations are seemingly random. They don't cite some of those foundational studies that I mentioned, like Whitehead and Kurz 2009, that I would sort of expect to see. Maybe some of Joanna Nichols' stuff. Lee et al. 2019, that prevalence of pole dance injury study that I've seen cited a lot of places. So is there a conflict of interest in funding? Did the people who pay for the research want the outcome of the research to be a specific way, in a way that might have exerted pressure on the researchers? If so, maybe something to keep an eye on. And is the publication venue suspect? Is it predatory? Is it basically a scam preying on vulnerable scholars? Or is it a journal run by a scholarly organization? So that was a big long list of things to think about. And when I'm going out and reading studies and trying to be like, okay, I want to update my knowledge, there's not a lot of sort of journalists working in pole dance research. And by not a lot, I mean, as far as I can tell, zero. Like, I don't think that's anybody's beat. So I kind of have to do it myself, but thankfully I have enough training that I can I'm beginning to build my understanding of the space. So I will make sure to put citations to the articles that I mentioned in the show notes. You can go check those out. If somebody doesn't share any citations, what they are doing is not science. It is maybe science scented, maybe science flavored, but it is not, the activity of scholarship. So that's what I look out for when I am reading studies and trying to decide if, okay, am I going to use this to influence what I do in my teaching? Because being evidence-based is really important to me. And if you are trying to be an evidence-based practitioner, you also have to be able to evaluate the evidence. So that's what I'm out here trying to do. All right, thanks so much for joining me, and I will talk to you next week. Bye. Thanks so much for joining me today, pole dancer. This podcast is a production of Slink Through Strength, the inclusive, evidence-based online pole studio. So if you're looking for a place to train, either off-pole conditioning and flexibility, or learning pole tricks and refining your pole movement, you can find us online at slinkthroughstrength.com.